and partner. We and our staff have maintained a solid working relationship based on mutual respect. And Senator, I look forward to continuing our good work together this year. Madam Secretary, welcome. Welcome back to this subcommittee. You, of course, are here to talk about the fiscal year 2025 budget request, but I want to first thank you for the work you and your team did on the fiscal year 24 request, because the input and discussions between our teams, both Senator Hagerty's team and my team and your team, helped us deal with a tight budget, I think, in the best way we could. So I want to thank you and your team for that. As we look to this year's budget request, fiscal year 2025, the Treasury Department requests $14.4 billion, which is an increase of $180 million or 1% over the last fiscal year. I look forward, Madam Secretary, to hearing more from you today about how this request can advance the Treasury Department's important missions here at home and abroad. The Department of Treasury plays a central role supporting a strong economy and promoting opportunity for all Americans, and it does through a variety of efforts and variety of initiatives. Madam Secretary, I do want to commend you and the President for your efforts to address the lack of affordable housing, a challenge that predates the pandemic but continues with us to this day. The lack of housing supply has driven up costs to where now nearly half of all renting households spend more than 30% of their income on housing costs. So I was pleased to see the Treasury Department continue to take and propose steps as recently as March to increase the stock of affordable housing and lower costs through a variety of proposals, including tax credits. With respect to the IRS, which of course is a major part of the overall Department of Treasury budget, the request this year is for $12.3 billion in discretionary funds, essentially flat funding with last year. Of course, the Inflation Reduction Act did provide substantial resources to the IRS, and I'm pleased to see those additional resources are already making an important difference. And I know, Madam Secretary, you'll talk a little bit more about them, but they include, in summary, dramatic improvement to taxpayer services, really beginning to modernize antiquated IRS systems, and of course, utilize the resources to make sure that very, very wealthy people, millionaires, billionaires, and big corporations pay more of the taxes that are already due and owing on the enforcement side. On the taxpayer services front, the IRS has made a number of improvements, reducing call wait times for taxpayers, adding more customer service representatives, reducing the backlog of paper returns, and staffing up taxpayer assistance centers. I want to thank you and the team at the IRS for your efforts to do that. I also do want to salute you for the success of the recently concluded year-long direct file pilot program, which allowed taxpayers in 12 states the option of filing their federal tax returns online for free directly to the IRS, and I was pleased to see the announcement of the plan to extend that nationwide. All Americans deserve a free and easy filing option, and I'm pleased to see the progress the IRS is making on that. On the enforcement side, we have estimates ranging from $500 billion to $1 trillion a year that are due and owing, but not paid. To be clear, this is not about going after small businesses or households earning less than $400,000 a year, and you've made that very clear, Madam Secretary. The Inflation Reduction Act, of course, has also made a big investment in our clean energy objectives, helping generate over $850 billion in clean energy and manufacturing investment from the private sector. And I want to thank you and your team for the work that you are doing to implement the provisions of that legislation. On the global front, and Senator Hagerty and I have worked together on a number of global initiatives, I want to applaud your continued efforts to implement tough sanctions on Russia, including the price cap to reduce Russian oil revenues as Putin continues his attacks on the people of Ukraine. I'd like to highlight your commendable work implementing the Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity for Ukrainians, or REPO, Act. You've made it clear that the United States will work to build consensus with our G7 allies on a plan to utilize the value of immobilized Russian sovereign assets to help address the issues within Ukraine. There's much more, of course, to talk about on the international front, as well as the domestic front, which we will get to in questions. But let me end where I began by thanking you, Madam Secretary. Thank you for your team. It's wonderful to have you back. And let me turn it over now to Senator Hagerty for his opening statement.
Well, Chairman Van Hollen, I want to thank you for holding this hearing, and I look forward to having many more during the course of this fiscal year. The agencies within the jurisdiction of this subcommittee have a far-ranging impact on the American economy and on the operations of the federal government. As the ranking member of the subcommittee, I look forward to working alongside you and our colleagues to conduct rigorous oversight to strengthen U.S. financial institutions and ensure that the dollars that the taxpayers have entrusted to us are spent responsibly. I also want to welcome our witness, Secretary Yellen. Thank you for appearing before the subcommittee, Secretary. It's a critical time for our economy. I'm glad to see you here today. The Department of the Treasury has a fundamental role in managing our nation's debt and collecting its taxes. The President, with the advice and consent of the Senate, has conferred upon you a great responsibility and obligation to provide sound economic guidance. At the same time, it's your duty to respect the rights of taxpayers who rely on you to treat them fairly. The Department has a deep impact on a broad range of issues, from issuing debt to reviewing foreign investments to imposing sanctions. Sanctions under the Trump administration worked, but they're not working now because this administration has deliberately relaxed enforcement. When I served as U.S. Ambassador to Japan, I helped implement the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. In particular, because Japan was a major buyer of Iranian oil, I persuaded then Prime Minister Abe to support U.S. secondary sanctions and stop buying Iranian crude oil. President Trump's maximum pressure campaign against Iran yielded powerful results. Iran's revenue from the export of crude oil products dropped from $60 billion in 2018 to below $20 billion in 2019 to below $8 billion in 2020. President Biden, however, has abandoned the maximum pressure strategy under the Biden administration. Iran's revenue from exports of oil products has risen to over $100 billion. Iran's the world's biggest state sponsor of terrorism, and they've used this financial windfall to increase funding and support for Hamas, for Hezbollah, and for the Houthis. Think about the Houthis that are attacking ships in the Red Sea, Hezbollah, Hamas, menacing our ally Israel every day. Sanctions only work when they're enforced. Another area that I'm deeply concerned about is that the department may have let politics influence the amount of debt issued and the manner in which the Treasury issues its debt. Any action that fails to provide stability and minimize risk to taxpayers deviates from the department's core mission, and I'm concerned about the risk that this presents. In regard to the IRS, I'm concerned about their spending decisions. The IRS is using one-time funding to hire 1,700 people on a permanent basis, staff that it can't afford and would need to furlough without a new transfer authority from this committee. The current IRS budget assumes this one-time spending would be made permanent. That forces Congress to make a difficult decision in the future, either provide billions of dollars of more funding or potentially fire hundreds, if not thousands, of IRS employees. The IRS needs to figure out how to operate within the funds that Congress has already appropriated and within the authority that Congress has already authorized. Another shell game that the IRS is playing is with direct file. The IRS, the General Services Administration, and the U.S. Digital Service jointly developed the direct file. But the IRS either cannot or they will not share the total cost of direct file with the Congress. The IRS reported its own cost at only $24 million. Still, that works out to be $179 per successfully filed return. But that excludes the cost to GSA and to the USDS. When combined, the total cost to the U.S. government, and that's not just the IRS, of a successfully filed return could easily exceed the most expensive commercial off-the-shelf tax preparation software. It doesn't look like a good economic result for American taxpayers. Additionally, 3.3 million taxpayers were curious enough, at least, to inquire about direct file. They actually began the eligibility screening process. But of those 3.3 million taxpayers, only 140,000 actually succeeded in filing a return. Yet the IRS isn't curious about why the other 3.2 million didn't complete the direct file process, and they don't seem to have any plans to ask why. I don't understand why you would agree to make direct file permanent without understanding why the program has only a 4% adoption rate. Finally, I think American taxpayers would also like to understand why the IRS leaker, Charles Littlejohn, who has started serving his prison sentence, was charged with only one count of unlawful tax return disclosure. He stole more than 8,000 tax returns over a period of 2 years. He did it for the purposes of damaging his victim's reputation and affecting the outcome of the presidential election. Based on the sentencing hearing transcript, the lack of charges seemed to frustrate the judge, and it's certainly baffling to me. Secretary Yellen, I hope you'll address these and other concerns, and I look forward to your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Secretary Yellen, you're well known to this committee, so I'm going to keep my introduction very brief. Secretary Yellen is the first person to have led the White House Council of Economic Advisors, the Federal Reserve, and the Department of Treasury. Madam Secretary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Chairman Van Hollen, Ranking Member Haggerty, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to testify and for your support of the Treasury Department. Over the past 3 years, Treasury has helped drive an historic economic recovery and put our economy on a strong path for the medium and long term. GDP growth has been strong, growing 3% over the past 4 quarters. Inflation has declined substantially since its peak, even as we have more work to do to address high costs and give families more breathing room. The labor market is remarkably healthy, and companies have announced over $850 billion in clean energy and manufacturing investments since the start of this administration, including in places that historically had not received significant investment or where investment had declined. To support this, Treasury has played a leading role in implementing the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act. We've also been focused on taking action beyond our borders to strengthen America's economic leadership and national security. I'm heartened that Congress passed crucial support for Ukraine and for other allies. Treasury continues to impose sanctions to constrict Russia's ability to wage war, and we're working with our partners to unlock the economic value of immobilized Russian sovereign assets. Treasury is also using the tools at our disposal to respond to conflict in the Middle East and to responsibly manage the U.S.-China economic relationship, including making sure that American workers and firms can compete on a level playing field and protecting our national security. Let me now highlight several key requests in the President's fiscal 2025 budget that will enable Treasury to continue advancing America's economic interests. First, the budget requests $12.3 billion in discretionary resources for the Internal Revenue Service. Thanks to IRA funding and annual appropriations, we have already seen unprecedented improvements. This filing season, we made it easier for taxpayers to file their taxes and get the credits they're owed, including by providing 11,000 additional hours of in-person assistance. 140,000 taxpayers saved millions in tax preparation fees through the pilot of Direct File, an easy and free way to file taxes online directly with the IRS. We have also increased enforcement to make sure wealthy taxpayers and large corporations pay their fair share, collecting millions in unpaid tax debt from millionaires. We need resources so that we can continue saving the American people time and money and helping reduce the deficit. The IRS is inviting all states to participate in direct file as soon as next filing season and intends to expand it to support all of the most common tax situations over the next few years. And we will keep working to close the tax gap driven by wealthier Americans, which costs us over $600 billion a year. Second, the budget requests funds to allow Treasury to address emerging threats, such as $312 million for Treasury's departmental offices, including to support investment security in sensitive technologies and the stability of the financial system, and $150 million to enhance cybersecurity and protect our systems against intrusion by malign state actors. And third, the budget requests $231 million for the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, which provides critical financial intelligence and sanctions-related economic analysis, including to support sanctions related to Hamas, Iran, and Russia. It also requests $216 million for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network to protect the financial system and combat illicit finance. Thank you. I'm happy to now take your questions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, and we'll do 5-minute rounds, 7-minute rounds, 7-minute rounds, so 7-minute rounds per member. I do want to start on some of your more recent work with respect to meeting with our G7 partners and others to address what seems to be an increase or ongoing transfer of technology from China to Russia to support Putin's war machine efforts. I think that while China has not provided any direct military support in the form of weapons, we have seen, according to American assessments, a large surge of Chinese sales to Russia of machine tools, microelectronics, and other technology that Moscow is using to produce missiles, tanks, aircraft, and other weaponry for the use in the war against Ukraine. I know the President and our allies a number of years ago made it clear that any direct military support from China to Russia would be seen as a red line. While this is not direct military transfers, and I do want to make that clear based on what we know today, what's happening is clearly benefiting the Putin war machine. So, Madam Secretary, can you talk about how we can work with our allies, whether we collectively impose sanctions on Chinese companies that are engaged in this kind of transfer, or other options on the menu that you're looking at?
Yes, we, as you noted, are very concerned. There are substantial exports. We've seen an increase in exports from China to Russia, and particularly of certain dual-use goods that may be critical to Russia's war effort. And let me say that I have been extremely clear at the highest levels of the Chinese government that this is something we will not tolerate, and that we intend to sanction this activity. We're putting sanctions both in place on firms that are engaged in this activity, and a new executive order allows us to sanction financial firms that are promoting the export of these dual-use items or military goods to China. We know that our sanctions will be most effective if we work closely with our allies, and this is something I have discussed with all of my finance minister colleagues, the need for us to coordinate our sanctions behavior. I know that this set of concerns was recently conveyed by President Macron, by President von der Leyen and by Chancellor Scholz in their recent engagement. Anything to I will just say we're committed to working closely with our allies on this issue and believe it's essential to reduce the flow of these goods to Russia.
Well, I appreciate that update, and I do hope action will be taken soon, because the trajectory, as you indicated and as I outlined, is clearly in the wrong direction. And these dual-use items, as you described them, are being put to use by Putin directly to advance and support the war against the people of Ukraine. So I think concerted action is necessary to be effective, and I hope it will be taken soon. On a related matter, we, United States, have worked with our allies to try to prevent the transfer of very high-end technologies to China in the first place, whether they be very high-end semiconductors, AI, other technologies. And part of that strategy has been implemented through the Department of Commerce. As you well know, to put in place some outbound investment screening to prevent U.S. companies, some of the companies in our allied countries, from investing in China in areas that could then be used by the PRC for military purposes. That requires joint action in order to be effective. So, Madam Secretary, can you just speak to where we are in the effort to develop very clear boundaries and guidelines when it comes to outbound investment, number one, and number two, key allies?
So, as you know, we completed an advance notice of proposed rulemaking on outbound. We've received many comments which proposed, and really over a year or more, we realize about the necessity of doing similar kinds of investment screening. And this would apply both to inbound investment screening, something similar to our CFIUS process, and also outbound screening. And we have ongoing discussion. Our allies are looking at this carefully, working on their own systems. I think all of us recognize that this is something where joint action is more effective, and we continue to focus on trying to help our allies get up to speed on this as well.
Well, I appreciate that. You know better than anybody that capital flows can move really at the speed of light across borders. So successful. Senator Hagan.
Secretary Yellen. One of the most Treasury Secretary is to issue and manage U.S. debt. Given rising deficits, this is an increasingly difficult task. Nonetheless, proper management of our nation's debt keeps our funding costs low and maintains the dollar status as the world's reserve currency. In light of this, I'm very concerned about the recent Borrowing Advisory Committee comprise 15 to 20% of the total U.S. debt. But right now, T-bill supply is 25% above that range. This means that the department has issued more than $1 trillion in short-term bills that normally would have been issued as longer-term notes and bonds. This surge in bill issuance severely impedes the market's ability to price risk. It also typically only occurs during recessionary periods. And I'm perplexed by this decision to issue so much on the short end of the curve while yields are inverted. Given current yields, excessive reliance on bills costs taxpayers more money in interest expenses because of the need to roll over short-term financial rates. It also constrains our country's ability to respond to future economic shocks. And perhaps most alarmingly, this approach to debt management undermines the Treasury's credibility because it creates the perception that the administration could be easing financial conditions for political purposes. This chart will help us visualize what I'm talking about. What you can see here is during the 2008 crash, a spike in the issuance of short-term bills. Again, in 2020, you see the next spike in short-term bill issuance right here. Again, we've got the pandemic in 2020, we've got the Great Recession in 2008. Now we see not the case. Second, it could be that you're waiting to lock in longer-term issuances until the Fed has cut rates. To time the market in this manner. But the most dangerous could be that you're suppressing rates in order to ease financial conditions, to ease financial conditions for President Biden in an election year leading up to November. And I think that creates an extreme concern. Which one of these three would it be, Secretary Yellen?
Well, first of all, let me say we never time the market. A tenet of Treasury debt management is that issuance should be regular and predictable, and that's appropriate over time to
And yet it's
finance
spiking.
the government.
You can see from the chart that it's spiking right now.
Well, we had a substantial increase in the deficit in connection with the pandemic.
But what underlies the decision to do it so much weighted toward the short end while the yield curve is inverted?
Actually, if you look at history, the weighted average maturity of Treasury debt overall is about 71 months, and that is above the long-run average, which is shorter, at 61 months. And issuance of bills, in spite of what you're showing there, is in line with historical averages as
Well, it's certainly above the recommended range, Madam Secretary.
Of overall issuance. Treasury bills with a maturity of 1 year or less currently represent just under 22% of Treasury debt, and the long-run average is 22.4. It's very close to being in line with the guidelines suggested by market participants who take part in the Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee and the primary dealers.
I would very much like to get a better understanding of this, and I've introduced legislation that would have the Treasury report to this committee on the debt issuance process and how you're thinking about it so we can get a better understanding, because the concerns that I raised are real. I hear them very often, and I think it would be quite helpful for us to clarify this.
We would be glad to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's turn our discussion to sanctions now, Secretary Yellen. Iran is the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism. They send hundreds of millions of dollars per year to terrorist proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, who have murdered scores of American citizens and who desire to wipe Israel from the face of the map. And Secretary Yellen, is it the policy of the Biden administration to minimize revenue that Iran derives from illicit oil sales?
Yes, it is. And I agree with what you just said. It is our priority to sanction Iran, to diminish its ability to export oil.
But you said it's a priority. However, I just went through the results of the maximum pressure campaign. We had Iran down to below $8 billion in exports in the previous administration. In this administration, the sanctions enforcement has failed miserably. They're back up over $100 billion. What's changed then? If the policy hasn't changed, what has?
Well, we've continued to take action against those in Iran who are facilitating the export of oil. There is a shadow fleet that it's proven difficult for our sanctions to touch. Our sanctions are most effective when they target financial institutions, but we continue to take sanctions actions. We are very active in addressing terrorist financing by the Iranian regime.
I'm running short
and
of
its
time, Madam
proxies.
Secretary. I'd just like to close with this comment. I've been involved in the imposition of sanctions. It's hard work. The program right now is not working, obviously, because what we've seen is illicit oil sales dramatically increase under this administration. I understand that there are complex reasons why that may be the case, but it requires difficult work, hard work, and I encourage this administration to take its sanctions enforcement seriously because we're failing right now. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Haggerty. Senator Coons.
Senator Van Hollen, Chairman Van Hollen, thank you. Thrilled to see your leadership here at FSGG. Ranking Member Haggerty. Madam Secretary, thank you for the chance to work closely with you in the last year in my role as Chair of State and Foreign Operations. We had a great partnership in meeting our commitments to the multilateral development banks, in unlocking $21 billion to the IMF through the PRGT, and in finding ways to help developing countries deal with the consequences of COVID, of heightened debt, of the consequences of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and principally meet competition from the PRC, which is seeking to capitalize on the vulnerabilities of developing countries. So I look forward to working with you on continuing that work. I just returned from a trip to Southeast Asia where I got to meet with the leadership of the Asian Development Bank and look at how the Luzon Economic Corridor may well be a key part of our Indo-Pacific strategy. Focusing on the issues before us for this year's appropriation, though, for your committee, your department. When Congress passed the CHIPS and Science Act, a key part of our goal was revitalizing American semiconductor manufacturing. I was just in Taiwan and the Philippines and met with leaders in semiconductor manufacturing. I'm concerned about Treasury's implementation of tax credits and making sure that they reach upstream players in the semiconductor industry. I was encouraged by your recent remarks in a House hearing that Treasury and Commerce are working together to cover the entire supply chain. Well, when do you think we could expect final rules that would make credit available to manufacturing facilities that are producing semiconductor materials that are critical component parts of the semiconductor supply chain?
So this is an issue that we're working on very hard. We're trying to get the final rules out as quickly as possible. This is an issue that we explicitly, how far up the supply chain to go. We asked for comment on this. We have received a great deal of feedback. We understand the need for certainty on the part of businesses, and we'll try to get the regulations out just as soon as possible. But we are working closely with the Department of Commerce. They have direct funding, right, and we want to make sure that we are providing adequate support.
And I respect and understand, and I've talked to the Secretary, the role that Commerce has in the grant funding for fabs. My concern is that we also support the other businesses and industries that are a part of semiconductor manufacturing. Let me move on. There's some key decisions also not yet made in terms of 45V rulemaking. There are, I think, 7 regional hydrogen hubs that have been chosen through the Inflation Reduction Act that will help support regional economic renewal across the country. My concern is that we need to hit the right balance in 45V to actually provide the opportunity for takeoff for a future hydrogen industry in the United States. I do not think that it's assured that that will happen. The hubs which were selected 8 months ago can't move ahead without certainty about how this investment profile will look. Does Treasury need more resources in order to finalize the 45V rulemaking? Is that part of the limitation in terms of getting these rules out?
It's not a matter of resources. It's really a matter of the complexity of the issues that are involved here and the working through. I believe there were over 40,000 comments received on the guidance that we put out on 45V. We recognize the issues that the hydrogen hubs face and are working hard. We're working jointly with the Department of Energy and also with EPA to try to figure out how to address this. We've
I know-
received a lot of comments making suggestions, which we're taking seriously.
I know some of the comments you've received are from my region, from Delaware, from Pennsylvania, from New Jersey, where the Mach 2 regional hub leadership is very concerned about what impact the Treasury rules will have on whether or not they're going to be viable. So I would urge careful consideration of those comments.
I understand, and we will.
Let me conclude, if I could, with an issue I think of real interest to both of us, which is financial inclusion and the development of a national strategy. Too many Americans still lack access to basic financial services, and those with access are unable to effectively reap the benefits of access to financial services. This is something the financial services and some of the consumer advocacy groups in my state have long been passionate about. Treasury, I think, is nearing the completion of the strategy that was required in last year's bill. It's an opportunity to make sure federal agencies are coordinating with each other, with the private sector, with state and local governments, with nonprofit groups. And Treasury will have to keep leading in the implementation of this strategy for financial inclusion. What do you see as the most important steps in finalizing and implementing your financial inclusion strategy, and how could we be helpful in Congress?
So you have been extremely helpful. Let me say how much I appreciate your leadership on this issue. We've made a lot of progress. We've been engaging in robust public and stakeholder outreach and engagement. We've met with over 150 stakeholder organizations, and we're hoping to finalize these recommendations this summer.
Well, thank you, Madam Secretary. We're going to have a very busy summer finalizing some rules, some strategy, and then moving forward with them. And I appreciate the opportunity to partner with you across these three important areas.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, always good to see you.
Likewise.
Right now, in our current fiscal year, by our, I mean the federal government, we're running looks like about a $1.1 trillion deficit. Is that correct?
About 1.6, I believe.
1.6 trillion. I'm sorry. It's even worse than I thought. And that, of course, means that we're spending $1.6 trillion more than we're taking in revenues. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And we're filling the hole by borrowing money. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, if you personally were borrowing money, would you rather pay 5.4% interest or 4.4% interest?
The less the better.
Ma'am?
The less the better.
Okay. Then why aren't you doing that with federal borrowing?
Well, in federal borrowing, our objective is to issue at least cost over time and not to try to time the market.
Yeah, but you are timing the market. You issued a press release back in November that you were going to try to time the market. I mean, right now, you can issue 3-month treasuries. These are yesterday's yields at roughly 5.4%.
Yes.
But you could issue a 10-year Treasury note for 4.4% and save. Let me finish. And save the taxpayer a lot of money. And then last November, you issued a press release. You said we're going to start borrowing more short-term debt than we normally would. At the beginning of 2023, our short-term debt was about 15%. And last November, you said we're going to increase that.
To about.
And now it's about 22, 23%.
Correct.
You're costing the taxpayers billions. Why are you doing that?
So, Senator, you say it costs 5.4%. That's what it costs this year.
No, that's what it cost yesterday.
Yes, but when you issue 10-year bonds, you're locking in the 10-year rate over 10 years. And that 10-year rate, the reason that holders of 10-year Treasury bonds are willing to accept a 4.3, 4.4% yield is because when those same individuals could be investing at 5.4%.
Madam Secretary.
No, I'm sorry, I would like to.
Madam Secretary, that's just, no offense. That's double talk.
It isn't
Here's
double
my
talk because
maybe
it
it's
is
my fault.
expected that
Maybe it's my
interest-
fault.
No,
Today, you can borrow for 3 months at 5.4%, but instead you're choosing, strike that. Today, you can borrow for 10 years at 4.4%. Instead, you're choosing to borrow at 5.4%.
market participants believe that.
That makes no sense.
Market participants believe that short-term interest rates will come down, and they will come down to a level substantially
So you are
below
trying to time the market.
current 10-year rate.
You are trying to time the
And
market.
so, no, it isn't a question of timing the market. It's we issue across the curve in a regular and predictable way.
You don't.
And
You
the reason
announced
that
last
paying.
November, you announced last November, I can show you the press release, where you said that we have decided to start issuing an inordinately large amount of short-term debt, didn't you?
We did make an announcement
And
about it.
because of the inverted yield curve, that means that you're going to pay more in interest on short-term debt than, say, 10-year debt.
Only for a short time.
Now, that's a fact, okay? You can go check the numbers of Treasuries yesterday. That is, first, that costs taxpayers a lot more money in interest. And number two, you're working at cross purposes with the Federal Reserve, because what you're doing is stimulating the market. You're pumping money into the economy. And Jay Powell is over here beavering away trying to reduce inflation. And you're beavering away trying to increase it by
There's nothing
paying
that we're doing
an interest
that's-
rate that is 100 basis points higher than you would have to pay. And the only reason I can figure that y'all are doing that is to try to give the economy a sugar high 5 months before an election. Why else would anybody want to borrow at 5% when you can borrow at 4%?
Well, there is a good reason that investors are willing to accept just over 4% on a 10-year Treasury bond when they can earn 5.4% on a one-year
I'm not
Treasury
worried about
bill.
the investor.
Well,
I'm
the
not worried
same-
about the investor.
it's
I'm
the
worried
same-
about the taxpayer.
It's the same logic.
And let me ask you again, because I'm going to run out of time. And look, you're smarter than me. I know that. But I can grasp this concept. You're borrowing at 5% when you could borrow at 4% to deficit spend.
If I borrow it,
And
if
it makes absolutely no sense to me why you
I
would
am
do
sorry,
that,
if I
other than
the reason
to try
is-
to artificially stimulate the economy
if
and
I
help Joe
borrow
Biden
at
get
4%, if I borrow at 4.5%, I'm locking in that cost over 10 years.
but you just
If
said
I
you weren't
borrow
trying
at
to time the
5
market.
Well,
You are trying to time the market.
it isn't trying to time the market because this is something that is a regular part of our policy. When short-term rates are high, and long-term rates are lower, the reason for that is that market participants expect short rates to go down, and they expect them to decline over 10 years to substantially under 4.5%. So even if we pay more this year than it would cost to borrow at a 10-year rate of 4.5%, the expected cost over the 10-year life of that borrowing can be the same or less than it would be if we issued a 10-year note. Now, we're not trying to time the market. we have a policy that we want to hold the issuance of short-term bills in line with recommendations of the Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee.
Can I say something now? Madam Secretary, I'm going to say it again. You're a lot smarter than me. But my mama didn't raise a fool. And if she did, it was one of my brothers. And what you're doing, you know it and I know it. And all those people sitting behind you know it. You're paying 5% to borrow money when you could pay 4% to borrow money. You announced you were going to do that back in November 2023. You're working cross purposes with Jay Powell.
We're not working.
And the reason you're doing this, is try to give the economy a sugar high 5 months before an election. Now, you know that, and I know that.
There's nothing about issuing short-term debt that creates a sugar high for the economy.
My chairman says I'm out of time. It's good to see you.
He's such affable. He's just very nice. Madam, I'm going to continue with the questioning now, if I may. You want to go ahead and restart? But anyway, good to have you. Thank you for your service. And first of all, I want to talk about the Bureau of Fiscal Service Management as far as the office in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Okay? The employees are not coming back to work. Now, I know that Senator Romney and I have introduced a piece of legislation that would say that at least 60% of the time they have to be in their office at work, okay? And I think that basically a relatively small increase above the 50% mark mandated by the Office of Management and Budget. OMB has said 50% of the time. I don't know if you know this or not, but that office in Parkersburg, West Virginia, people only have to be there 2 days of pay period. 2 days of pay period. What they end up doing, they come at the end of the first pay period, stay 2 days. The beginning of the second pay period, stay 2 days. There are 4 days out of a total of 2 pay period. It's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous, and it's destroying the economy and the people that should be coming to work. They're living anywhere and they fly in. And this has got to stop. And you have to stop it, Madam Secretary, because it's not going to happen unless you clamp down tight. The rules say OMB at least 50%. We'll accept 50%. At least I get them there 10 days out of 20, okay?
I appreciate the problem that this is causing, and I know that you've written a letter to Treasury about this.
We have specifics now we can help you all with. And now my next round is going to be, I want to be as respectful as I can because I totally disagree with what you all are doing, implementing the EV credits. The EV credits, electric vehicle credits. I know that because we wrote the bill. My committee wrote the bill completely.
I know.
And we wrote the intent of the bill. We have all the findings of what we did and how we did it. But let me just show this right here, Madam Secretary. The bill was very much written so that we would bring America back, bring manufacturing back to America, that we would not be relying on unreliable supply chains, especially the countries of 4 concerns, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And as we know, China has dominated the critical minerals industry. But here's what you all have done. Your permanent rules, these are your permanent rules, came from y'all. This is how we wrote the bill. It's in the bill, specific. First year, 2023, 40%. You all cut it in half to 20.
I'm sorry, I can't.
Okay, this is here.
See that.
This is 40%.
What is 40? What is 40?
Let's get it up there closer. You can see how it does, okay? First year, second year, third year. You've cut everything in half. Everything in half. It makes no sense because you're going to get sued on all of this from people who have been damaged. The manufacturers that are investing money that thought that they would not be inundated with lower prices, unfair competition, especially from China, you've given them the ability to come after them now. Okay, you can see this all the way through.
So why do you think we've cut this in half? You're talking about the requirements
of what should be from
batteries and battery components
processing
and for
critical
minerals
sourcing and processing. You've even tried to change the definition of processing to where some of the manufacturing can be done and considered in processing. You've done that. We have all of that. The only thing I'm trying to be very respectful. You are going to be sued, and we're going to do a writ of mandamus, amicus brief, to help the people that are suing because this is how we wrote the bill. We wanted it to be America. We wanted it to be with free trade agreement countries. We wanted it not to be reliant on China. This absolutely allows China in the market and staying in the market for the entire extent of the IRA.
I'm sorry, you know, we put out the FIAC restrictions that pertain to China, and those restrictions mean that this year you can't have battery components that are made in China, and next year a vehicle
Why did you cut it in
can't-
half then? Why did you cut it in half?
Cut what?
You cut basically the requirement of how much had to come from where. This had to come from America Free Trade Agreements. This can come from non-free, anywhere else in the world. This is what's happening. I can go into it in detail, but this is, I have been raising absolutely holy Cain from day one. Now, we wrote the IRA as a very balanced bill to have energy. As far as basically, if we're going to basically change our entire transportation mode, it's the first time in the history of the United States of America we cannot basically provide all the components for a transportation mode. We're willing to be reliant on, especially of China, which had a total lock on the EVs.
We share the objective that you have, which is to rid ourselves of dependence
Who on your staff
China.
changed this in half,
And
ma'am, I would say?
I'm not sure. I think we need to have a technical discussion
We've
of
been
this.
calling you about,
because
anybody here, any of you all work
because-
on this?
Because I believe that the rules we wrote are in accord with what's in the statute.
And again,
about what's
I'm
required.
trying to be as respectful as I can. They absolutely are not. And I am encouraging every manufacturer to sue you.
Well,
And I will do the amicus brief on behalf, and we'll show you exactly how we wrote the bill, the intent of the bill, and you'll lose every suit. I know that. So in order to avoid all of that, why can't we just basically implement the bill the way it was written? And I've said this, you all, and basically the administration, and these are people I've known forever, you're trying to implement a bill you never passed. This is not the BBB. This is the IRA.
Well, we shared the objective that
let's
you
go one step.
had in writing the bill.
I know.
And I believe we have implemented it in accordance
Let's go
with
one step
what's
further,
in
if
the
I may.
law.
Senator Coons, based on the hydrogen hub, okay? Now, let me explain. The hydrogen hub, we wrote that in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and then we came back and funded it in the IRA. This is how we wrote. This is how we wrote the bill. This is how we wrote. We're happy to share all this with you. I think, hopefully, some of your staff knows this. Where did additionality come in? Where did time matching come in? Where did regionality come in? Who made that up?
Well,
We never had one iota of a word in that written. We wrote the bill.
But-
And then all of a sudden, these are the conditions to get the credits. Now, with that, where's the other? Let me show you this one. This is from the 7 hubs. Every one of the hubs have written to you all. Now, can you have the California hub and the West Virginia hub that agree? Something's wrong. We must be on the right track. But you all, every hub to agree said it's no longer commercially viable if you do what you're doing, implementation of the hydrogen rules. This is what we're dealing with. It's killing us. We shouldn't be fighting within ourselves. Just implement, write the rules the way the bill was intended to write. We wrote it.
well, the hydrogen rule has to abide by the Clean Air Act definition of life cycle
Well,
emissions.
the whole thing is basically what.
And that
what-
means taking account of indirect emissions, which is where the complications come
complication
into
is this
play.
administration doesn't want anything that comes out of the ground. I'm fighting them tooth and nail. We're producing more energy than ever in the history of the United States of America. If it wasn't for that, your inflation would be sky high. The prices of gas would be at $5. And what we're doing, because we're using blue hydrogen, is where they're going nuts on. That's it. But you're going to have it in this mix, or we will not be energy independent.
We recognize that there's an issue with respect to the hydrogen hubs, and we've asked explicitly in the guidance we put out how people suggest addressing it. And we're reviewing the comments.
I'm
And
out of time, but I would love to sit down. We're trying to give you the benefit of the doubt in so many things, trying to work with you, but it just seems that's impossible because they're hell-bent on implementing things that were never intended in the bill and were not written in the IRA or any of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And we're going to continue to fight to make sure that you confirm,
Well, I would like to have
We'd be happy to do that, ma'am.
understand why you think we've halved.
Well, we can definitely show you word by word. And I hope that whoever's in this audience with you right now, or whoever wrote some of these things, I would like to have them in the room too.
Yes, I agree.
All righty, I'm sorry.
Madam Secretary, I apologize. I had to leave to to join a hearing with FBI Director Wray. It's good to be back, and I recognize the chair of the full committee, Senator Murray.
Thank you very much, Chair Van Hollen. Thank you, Secretary Yellen, for joining us. We all know that Treasury plays a pretty crucial role keeping our economy strong and stable and strengthening our family's financial security as well. And it plays an indispensable role in keeping our country safe. That's why I have been insisting that we find a solution to address the extremely tight spending caps we are facing, and that any increase in defense spending is at least matched by a much-needed boost in domestic priorities here at home. For starters, Treasury is responsible for absolutely vital sanctions enforcement work to choke off funds to our adversaries like Russia and Iran, not to mention drug cartels and traffickers. It also regulates banks to keep our economy sound, protect our families, and prevent Main Street from paying for Wall Street's mistakes. So I want you to know I'm going to keep working with my colleagues to underscore the need to increase vital non-defense resources at Treasury and so many other agencies. So with that, I do have some questions for you. I wanted to ask you about the Inflation Reduction Act. It invested significant resources in the IRS to improve and modernize the agency. And we have seen immediate benefits, like call wait times decreasing from 28 minutes to 3 minutes. New enforcement initiatives to ensure large corporations and the ultra-wealthy are paying their fair share. And new tools like the direct file, which has made it easier than ever for people to file their taxes, get their refunds. Nearly 14,000 people in Washington State used direct file for their taxes this year, and I'm really excited that the IRS is going to be expanding it to all 50 states next year. It is paramount we preserve these achievements through the annual appropriations process now. So I wanted to ask you, how does the FY25 budget request build upon the success of IRA investments?
Well, direct file was made possible by resources in the Inflation Reduction Act. They enabled us to invest in the IRS and deliver world-class service and develop the direct file, and we intend to continue using those resources to support direct file. We've recently decided to make it permanent. We'll extend to all 50 states. Hopefully, they'll all want to partner with IRS, those resources will be critical to covering the cost.
Does your budget request enable you to be able to expand it to all 50 states?
Yes, in the sense the request includes both an appropriation, annual appropriations, and also an increase in mandatory funding for the IRS, and that combination would enable us to do that.
Okay, very good. The Inflation Reduction Act has tasked the Treasury Department with an indispensable role in fighting the climate crisis. That law included a suite of clean energy tax credits, including the 45V for the production of clean hydrogen. Now, unfortunately, your proposed 45V rulemaking has thrown up some major roadblocks, which a vast coalition, including states, industry, labor have made very clear they're not workable. Washington State is home to one of the cleanest grids and some of the strongest state climate legislation in the country, and is already seeing some of the investments put on hold as a result of the proposed rule. It is no exaggeration to say that getting this rulemaking right may deliver tens of thousands of high-wage jobs while reducing emissions. So I wanted to ask you how you plan to address the concerns you're hearing and make sure that the final 45V rule helps rather than hinders the development of clean hydrogen projects.
Thank you for that question. We've heard a great deal of input on the issue of hydrogen hubs. we asked for input when we issued proposed regulations on how we could identify circumstances where there's minimal risk of significant induced grid emissions. And one of the issues there is how to take account of state policies. And so we have received input, and we're going to take that input into account as we revise the regulation.
Okay, so can you assure me when the final regulation comes out, we will see a better regulation to make sure our states can actually use these investments?
We will certainly try to address this issue.
Okay, I will look forward to seeing that. It's really critical for our hydrogen hub.
I hear you.
2 years ago, I helped pass a sweeping bipartisan retirement bill, Secure 2.0 Act. It's really important to me that Americans can retire with dignity. So I want to thank you for Treasury's guidance on the emergency savings. I know stakeholders are anxiously awaiting further guidance on provisions like the student loan match. Do you have at Treasury sufficient resources to implement these popular bipartisan measures?
Yes, we do, and we appreciate the support that you provided us this fiscal year, and we don't need additional resources. This is something we're going to get done.
Okay, very good. And finally, in the American Rescue Plan, Democrats expanded the child tax credit and lifted 5.3 million people out of poverty. That expansion nearly cut child poverty rates in half from the previous year, but that progress is being reversed with the expiration now of the CTC. I helped reintroduce that child care tax credit, which would expand and make it permanent. Can you talk about the immediate and long-term benefits expanding the CTC would have on working and middle-class families?
Well, I think it would be dramatic, and as you pointed out, in 2021, CTC is credited with having, it's the leading driver behind a 46% reduction in child poverty. There were record lows in Black, Hispanic, and Native American and Asian and white child poverty. And, you know, beyond the immediate reduction in child poverty, research also suggests that this kind of income support brings long-term gains in children's health, education, and earnings. So I think this is something that can have a profound effect on children and their well-being and futures.
Talk a little bit about how the president's budget request addresses child poverty.
Well, the president has requested in this budget request to expand the child tax credit and to make permanent full refundability and also advanceability. So we certainly would like to see the amounts increased and see full refundability.
Okay, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And now we'll hear from the Vice Chair of the Full Appropriations Committee, Senator Collins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Senator.
The IRS is relying on automation very heavily to answer taxpayers' questions. This filing season, about half of the callers received an automated response, while the other half were able to speak with a customer service representative. Now, I understand that there are certain taxpayer service functions that can be automated, and that can be an efficient and good way to serve the customer. But many taxpayers want to have contact with a live person, want to not deal with going through a menu, trying to figure it out, or they may have a more complex system. So how can the IRS increase the availability of customer service representatives to those taxpayers who want to speak with someone rather than go through a complicated menu that may not answer their question?
So I will confess, I'm not sure exactly how people are routed when they call the main number. But what I can tell you is that the amount of resources, the number of customer service representatives, and the service that's been achieved through the IRA investments, many people, more people are reaching live operators who answer their questions. Call wait times have declined on average to 3 minutes, and a standard metric that IRS uses, the level of service, increased above 85%, which is just a vast improvement from where we were 2 years ago. Taxpayer assistance centers are being staffed. There's a great deal more available in terms of customer service. I'm not positive just what happens when people reach an automated thing, but I can look into that.
Thank you. I'd appreciate that. Let me bring up a related issue. As of May 5th, the IRS expects its employees to return to the office for half of all their workdays. My first question would be, why only half?
Well, the guidelines that we've put in effect for all Treasury employees, including IRS, conform with OMB and administration guidance, which is half. Now, in many cases, and this certainly applies to IRS employees, what's required for many people is to be there full time. And this is true for large numbers of IRS employees. It's true for our employees who work in the Bureau of Engraving and Printing and the mint and manufacturing processes. So this differs. It's only half if that's something that's compatible with getting the job done. So our guidance throughout Treasury employees is we need to see what's necessary to effectively serve the American public, and only when telework is compatible with that is it permitted.
Well, I looked at the latest data from the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, and the Inspector General found that IRS employees teleworked 22% of the time, worked in person 37% of the time, and engaged in some sort of hybrid work 40% of the time on average during the first quarter of the fiscal year. So I'm trying to reconcile the data that's reported by the Inspector General to the IRS's goal of having its employees work half of their workdays in the office. It seems to me that the Inspector General found that they are not working half of their workdays in the office.
Some of the employees are covered by collective bargaining agreements. They're members of a union, and to enforce those rules requires an agreement with the union.
Let me just ask you one final question, and let me suggest that I think those contracts need to be renegotiated with the taxpayers' interests in mind.
Agreed.
Let me ask you about the main Treasury building. It has been identified as an underutilized building by the GAO in July, and I apologize if this has already been brought up by anyone. By GAO's estimate, less than 50% of the usable space was being utilized. Now, I understand that's an historic building, and that may limit that may pose some challenges to using the entire building, but it concerns me that we're paying for a costly building if it's being so dramatically underutilized when less than half of the building is being utilized. Is that due to the fact that people are working from home? Does the Treasury Department need to downspace its offices or bring more people back? What are your comments on that?
We are looking at our space requirements carefully. There are some programs that are growing and need more space and some that need less. I believe that we have, as a lease has expired, I'd need to get back to you with the details, but have relinquished one Treasury building. Main Treasury building, I'm not aware. My impression was that it was fully utilized, but I will get back to you with details on that. We are certainly looking at our space needs, but it's not simple because there are programs that are growing while others are shrinking, their needs are shrinking.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. And Madam Secretary, I have a few more questions here that I'd like to get to. We talked a little bit earlier about your ongoing efforts to implement the REPO Act, the Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity for Ukrainians Act, using some of the Russian assets to help the people of Ukraine. Could you just update the committee on where that effort stands in discussions with our partners with the G7 and elsewhere?
Yes, well, I personally believe that it's necessary and urgent for our international coalition to find a way to unlock the economic value of those immobilized Russian sovereign assets to support Ukraine. And the REPO Act was an important step. It enables us to do a whole variety of useful things. We want to work, if possible, and I believe it is possible, with our partners in the G7 and the European Union to settle on a coordinated way to unlock the value of these assets. And the G7 leaders will be meeting in June in just a couple of weeks in Apulia in Italy. And we're working together to try to find a way forward. Now, the European Union has taken a very important step that there are substantial assets at Euroclear, which the assets are frozen. They're Russian sovereign assets. Euroclear is earning interest on these assets. It doesn't belong to Russia, and it had been accruing to Euroclear, and the European Union has now taken action to take that, it's called the windfall profits, and to dedicate most of it for Ukraine. So that's a flow that amounts to somewhere in the 3 to 5 billion range per year and will accrue as long as they remain immobilized. We have been discussing the possibility of giving Ukraine, the G7, a loan and allowing the windfall, this flow of windfall profits, to be used to pay off those, the loans that would be given. And this is an approach that seems to be commanding considerable support. So we're hopeful that this can be worked into something to be presented to the leaders at the G7, the upcoming G7 meeting.
Well, I want to commend you and the Deputy Secretary and others on coming up with these creative, innovative proposals.
Thank you.
To garner the support of other countries that we need to work with as part of this effort. Another ongoing effort, as you know, which was launched a number of years ago now, was to put a price cap on Russian oil in order to reduce Russian oil revenues overall without impacting the global market price for oil. Those efforts have been, I think, somewhat successful. I think there's room for improvement, but could you provide a very brief update on where that effort stands?
Yes. So first year, the price cap, I think, was very successful. We saw a 40% decline in the Kremlin's oil revenues. And as you mentioned, the second goal is keep the market well supplied. Russia continued to sell oil. Now, Russia was able, after that, to build up a fleet, a so-called shadow fleet, and to find ways often to provide services like insurance that had been provided by Western companies. And by providing those services, they were able to continue selling oil, particularly to India and China. This was a considerable expense for Russia to have to do that, and there remains a significant discount on Russian oil. So essentially, although the oil continues to be sold, we forced Russia to make a hard choice, either abide by the cap and sell at a very low price, or invest massively resources, drawing money away from the war effort. One estimate is that Russia has to pay $36 a barrel to actually export a barrel of oil. So even if they're getting more than the $60 price cap, their expenses are considerable. Recently, their top oil official, the deputy prime minister, attested that price cap enforcement, which we've made stricter recently, has been costly to Russian energy exports and is driving down their profits. So we do have the Russians saying that they're being harmed by this. We've upped our sanctions activity. We sanctioned Russia's largest shipping company. We've required stricter enforcement by Western service providers that they're abiding by the price cap, and those steps seem to be effective. So I would describe the price cap as continuing to be somewhat effective at limiting Russia's revenue, and that includes driving up their expenses to sell this oil.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I also have one question, which I think will be a simple yes or no, but there's a lot of misinformation going around with respect to the Biden administration's effort to use some of the resources from the Inflation Reduction Act to go after only very high-end, very wealthy people who have not paid their taxes that are due and owing. So I just want to confirm for the record that your direction to the IRS was that audit rates are not to increase relative to historic levels for small businesses or households earning less than $400,000 a year.
That was my directive, and Commissioner Werfel has committed that he will not increase audit rates for families earning under $400,000 or small business taxpayers. They will not rise above 2018 levels.
And does the administration have any future plans to alter that very clear direction?
No, that the resources are intended to go after wealthy individuals who are not meeting their tax responsibilities, complex partnerships, and corporations, which is where most of the tax gap is estimated to originate.
Well, thank you for that. I do have one final area that I just want to convey some thoughts about, and then maybe you and your team can get back to me
Sure.
later. I want to applaud you and the Biden administration for issuing the executive order on imposing certain sanctions on persons undermining peace, security, and stability in the West Bank. This was the executive order issued by the president February 1st of 2024. The chairman of three committees with jurisdiction over this area, Senator Cardin on the Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Reid, Armed Services Committee, Senator Warner, an Intelligence Committee, have all written to the administration commending this action and urging you and the President and the Secretary of State to consider further actions with respect to addressing extremist settler violence on the West Bank, which, as you know, has created a very, very dangerous and combustible situation. Combustible is actually not the right word because it's already combusting. And really hope that the administration will use its authorities to send very clear signals as to what's acceptable and what is not. In that regard, though, I would just bring to your attention a New York Times Magazine piece from May 16th. It's the cover story. It goes into great detail, not only about extremist settler violence, but the conditions under this very extreme Netanyahu government that have allowed a lot of that violence to continue. And it especially talks about the actions of Mr. Smotrich, who wears two hats. One is as the Minister of Finance, where, as you know, he has really tried to prevent the Palestinian Authority's own tax revenues that are collected by Israel from being returned to the Palestinian Authority. Thank you for your efforts to keep the pressure on, because that just creates more and more instability. The PA, as you know, actually works with the United States and Israel on security cooperation, among other things, and so undermining and unfunding them obviously creates an even more unstable situation. But in addition to that, that hat that he wears as Minister of Finance, Smotrich also has a very important portfolio overseeing the West Bank. And in this New York Times Magazine piece, which, by the way, was written by two veteran investigative reporters, including an Israeli investigative reporter, it says, and I quote, one document describes a meeting in March when Major General Yehuda Fox, the head of Israel's Central Command responsible for the West Bank, gave a withering account of efforts by Bezalel Smotrich, an ultra-right leader and the official in Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government with oversight over the West Bank, to undermine law enforcement in the occupied territory. Since Smotrich took office, Fox wrote, again, Fox is with the IDF, Central Command. Since Smotrich took office, Fox wrote, the effort to clamp down on illegal settlement construction has dwindled, quote, to the point where it has disappeared, unquote. Moreover, Fox said, Smotrich and his allies were thwarting the very measures to enforce the law that the government had promised Israeli courts it would take. So, Madam Secretary, my point is this. As I read this executive order and what actions qualify to be sanctioned, it says those covered actions include directing, enacting, implementing, enforcing, or failing to enforce policies that threaten the peace, security, or stability of the West Bank. And by my reading, Mr. Smotrich's actions clearly meet that definition and that test. So I would urge the administration to consider imposing these sanctions on Mr. Smotrich, I think it's the right thing to do to send a signal that the kind of instability that he is creating, both through his efforts to cut off all funding to the PA, and I will say that he said in a letter to Prime Minister Netanyahu with respect to the Palestinian Authority, this is a quote, "We must bring about its downfall." That is in direct contradiction and violation of U.S. policy, and at least my understanding of the policy of the government of Israel, and yet you have this individual taking those actions against the Palestinian Authority, which the President Biden, of course, has seen as a partner in a government once we get the hostages freed and bring about a ceasefire in Gaza, as a partner with respect to governance in Gaza. So I would suggest that these actions he's taking, both to, quote, dismantle the PA, as well as to encourage and enable extremist settler violence and the expansion of settlements that are deemed illegal under even Israeli law, it seems to me it's an action that the administration should consider, and I would recommend it taking. I don't expect an answer today, but I would, Madam Secretary, ask you for your commitment to meet with me and my team to talk about this issue.
I would be glad to do that, and let me say we share your concerns about what's happening in the West Bank. As you mentioned, we have taken some actions. I've been very disturbed about the withholding of these revenues, and at I guess it was week before last, our G7 finance ministers meeting, our communique expressed joint concerns about this. I've written a letter to Prime Minister Netanyahu expressing my concerns about this and the general deterioration of economic conditions in the West Bank, and I would be glad to have follow-up conversations with you and your staff on this matter, but please know that we are also deeply, deeply concerned by and disturbed by what's happening here.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I have been following and appreciate the efforts you've taken and look forward to continuing to work with you and your team on this. Thank you, of course, for being here today, and the hearing record will remain open until Tuesday, June 12th, to allow senators to submit additional questions for the record. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you for your service. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Senator.